welcome to the Maritime Museum, David. We are very excited to listen to your talk.
Thank you.
Finding the Finnish factor. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Augusta. So, thank you. Good morning. My talk is called The Phoenix Factor. Excuse the Lady Gaga look. I think this is meant to be for the live stream, but I will introduce myself in a second. I just wanted to explain a little bit about why I'm here. I am essentially a little bit, come and grab a seat, a little bit obsessed with industrial heritage. And I've put up here, because I think this is what we have to do, my background. And I thought that I was in industrial heritage conservation, but in truth, I don't think I am. I think I'm more in community conservation to some extent, and I'll try and explain why. This is some of the projects that I've been involved in the last 20 years. One was a historic steamship, which was actually probably involved in the herring trade, probably came to Iceland. We acquired it for £1 and raised about 4.5 million. And I bring this up partly to give you a bit about my background, but partly because this seems to be, for me, the most important part of it all. And that's really what I want to talk about. What we thought we were doing was restoring a ship, and what we ended up doing was producing a community cohesion project, which became something more interesting. We got quite a bit of funding, we got quite a lot of support. We built a pontoon in Poland, and we lifted the ship onto the pontoon. And we thought that was the project, but in fact the project was this. It was much more about the people that we were working with. We worked with 2 communities. If you're familiar with London, the ship happened to be based in Canary Wharf for historic reasons, in a time when it was a part of London that was abandoned. Margaret Thatcher, in her wisdom, decided to build the financial centre of Canary Wharf on the old docks, and it then became a confusion or a conflation of 2 communities, one of the most disadvantaged communities in London, Newham, and then what became the haves, if you like, the have-a-lots, the financial world of the investment banks. And we built something that basically brought them together, and that became much bigger than the project that we thought we were doing. And this is just another of the projects. Again, we thought we were involved in bricks and mortar, if you like, or nuts and bolts, restoring a historic railway station. And what we ended up doing was producing a design and feasibility study for a migration museum, again, in a disadvantaged part of the country. But not all buildings of historic restoration need to be grand. This is a small Victorian brick pump house that we got involved in. This is something called the Arctic Corsair, which was the last Sidewinder trawler for Hull City Council, probably involved in the Cod Wars. We're not sure. Okay, thank you. We have a feeling that it probably has some historic significance for Iceland as well. This is a building that has historic significance for Londoners. Again, if you know London, you may not recognise it. I'll throw it out there. I don't know if anybody does. No? No, it's a good guess. It is a power station. It's Bankside Power Station. Most Londoners don't get this, and it's now Tate Modern. So again, a very grand project, obviously, but very much along the lines of what I want to talk about, which is the vision of 1 or 2 people who were at Tate Britain at the time, who saw the possibility of this building. And I can remember cycling around this in my 20s. I'm old enough to remember when it was an abandoned power station, and thinking, that'll be bulldozed pretty soon. That'll never work. And then eventually, it's now Europe's most successful modern art gallery. I think the numbers are in the region of about 6 million a year. So, it just gives you a little bit about my background. Excuse me, as I said, I'm not really about the bricks and mortar. I'm more about how the purpose of restoration works with communities. And that's part of the reason why I jumped at the chance to come to Ísafjörður, to the University Centre of the West Fjords, when they launched a course called Regional Development and Coastal Communities. And I wanted to find out whether some of the work that we'd done in the UK could be replicated in a study. So I decided to try and research this, which is a little bit convoluted, but basically, can the creative adaptation of disused industrial heritage be used for economic and social regeneration? For non-Icelanders, I'll just run through the economic background. Those of you from this part of the world will be familiar with the issue of declining fishing industry, economic instability, depopulation, and a need to build resilience. And none of that is specific to Iceland in particular, apart from maybe the fishing decline, because most coastal communities are suffering something similar. So this is to introduce you a little bit to the research. I was based up in Ísafjörður. I wanted to look at sites around the country. Obviously, I had access to the south and the west and the north, but I didn't get to the east or the southeast. And the site selection is probably a little bit random in the sense that it was based on access, but also availability of my interviewees, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'll bring up the list of the sites, and again, they are incredibly varied. And one of the reasons why I love this subject is because of the variation in the different sites and also the variation in the interpretation methods used to restore them. And in some cases, not to restore them. They're not all restored. I've used the original functions just for the list here, just to slightly be provocative. I'm sure you can probably guess what they are, but I'll go through them in a moment. What I did just at the beginning of the research was to try and understand the types of use or the types of interpretation, and I'll explain those as I go along. The first of the types I've called educational interpretation. So this is a classic reuse of a building, if you like. Classic is not meant to be pejorative in any sense. This is just what I've decided for my own research makes it easier to understand. So of these, I've used the Herring Era Museum and the Westfjords Heritage Museum. Classic interpretations, if you like. They are very closely linked to their original function. The other type that I've chosen was buildings that have used a different interpretation to their original function. And within that, we can talk about the Art Museum in Akureyri, the Koppelstadja Art Gallery, and the slaughterhouse, which became the Whale Museum. Now, you might argue there is a link. There is a small whaling exhibit within the Whale Museum, but clearly the Whale Museum and the slaughterhouse are not related. And this is one of my personal favorites, the fish freezer in Reef, and the work of Cowrie, who's a visionary who has managed to produce something that has made his peers want to stay behind and stay in his community. And that really is the kind of crux of my talk, if you like. It's how do we maintain a critical mass of activity within communities that makes people want to stay and engage and participate in their hometowns. So the third of the typologies I've called commercial spaces. You'll recognize this maybe as the restaurant down the road in the Marshall House, which again is the work of, I would call, two visionaries, Aussie and Steinthor at Kurtogby, architects who saw the potential of this building, but also the owners of the building who saw the potential and made it happen. And it's now obviously a successful art galleries and restaurant. And this is the type of configuration that I've called hybrids, if you like. They are part commercial, part non-commercial, and of that I've also included the enormous site that is going to be the Guveness Movie Studios. Another enormous and incredible vision. On a different scale, Edinburgh House in Ísafjörður, and on a very different scale, the guest house that was the Salt House in Skagastrand. So you can see there's so many different interpretations, so many different uses, so many different levels of restoration. And on that subject of levels of restoration, one of my types were the buildings that haven't been restored, but have been conserved. So there's a level of abandonment that is maintained, whether for financial reasons, whether for aesthetic reasons, whether for practical reasons. Those are the following. I've used Djupavik as a great example. Again, the work of, I would call them visionaries or leaders. Eva, Aussie, Kida, Magnus, and Hedin, who have made it into an incredible site in one of the remotest parts of Iceland, and the work of Gustavin Hjalteri, who has managed to transform the former herring factory into a contemporary art centre. And finally, the less positive side of things, those buildings at risk of demolition. And again, none of this is certain. That's the point about demolition. They're not demolished until they've gone. The tool sheds in Akureyri, the industry museum, now may be facing closure. We don't know. That's not necessarily demolition, but it may be lost, if you like. The artist residencies in Skagastrand, not the building itself, but there are workshops alongside which were slated to be demolished. But I believe, from information I got yesterday, that they are being reprieved. Reuberhofen, which the future is uncertain, and again, I'd be interested to know more about that. But from what I've understood from Byggnadsstofnun and the Fragile Communities Program, the future is not clear. And finally, a building that we could talk about maybe for hours in Fopnafjordur, which is due to be demolished this year. Built in the 60s, not listed. How important is it? I believe Minjastofnun's report says it's important, but the municipality has decided to go ahead and get rid of it because, for practical reasons, I believe it stands in the way of the fish plant. So those were the sites. But as I said at the beginning, I'm not really that interested in the buildings themselves. I know that it's it seems like it's an architectural presentation, but it isn't really intended to be. My interest is more about how these buildings relate to their communities, how we can use them to develop social cohesion and make them work for their localities. And out of that intention, I drew up these 6 research questions, which will become hopefully clearer in a moment. What I did was I interviewed 50 people over 18 months just before COVID. And then again, when I could get back to Iceland, I interviewed more in 2 stages. And they were essentially stakeholders involved in those sites that I've identified. So I didn't choose members of the public that weren't directly linked to the projects for various reasons, but partly because I wanted to try and segment most of the comments into direct usage of those sites. What I did was I coded up to about 3,000 comments into primary and secondary subcodes. I won't bore you too much with the methodology, but it ended up being some work with an application called MaxQDA, and I managed to use that software to identify the comments into different sections. Of those different sections, I basically came up with some conclusions, which I'll come on to. But obviously, out of 42 subtopics in a half-hour presentation, I can't possibly go through them. They are all in the report, which I'll be very happy to send you. But I'm just going to pick out the ones that really stood out to me as interesting. And if they sound negative, it's only because I think that they are potential ways to become more positive about the way that we approach industrial heritage. So some of the comments really related to what I can only describe as shame and humiliation, related to the association of those buildings. A turf house is not Notre Dame. A lot of these were kind of probably obvious to Icelanders. I don't know if they are. They struck me as quite harsh in many ways. Humiliation was a theme that came up in many of the conversations. I don't know where "we are not savages" comes from, but that was one of the comments. The issue for me seemed to be one of a lack of a sense of pride or respect in the built environment, and especially when it comes to industrial heritage. And out of this question of how heritage and local communities relate, I also picked out one of the themes that really struck me around volunteerism. And again, it seemed to be related to ideas of exploitation, perhaps. There was a lot of conflation between volunteerism and voluntourism, which sounds like a tiny semantic variation, but it's actually a massive difference. Volunteering has nothing to do with voluntourism. Voluntourism has, I believe, a lousy reputation in Iceland and across the world. There's a book just come out today about voluntourism, which is pretty critical. A well-managed volunteer project has nothing to do with that. Neither does it have anything to do with low-paid internships. But again, it's a subject that we could talk about for hours. So those were the two topics that prompted me to highlight them for the first question. The second of my questions I wanted to look at were how we describe value and success. Those I looked regenerative hubs. That's really that keeps coming back and back to the main topic, which is that the buildings that really manage to engage with their communities are the ones that create magnets. They manage to bring their constituency into them, and they manage to provide learning centers and co-working hubs that generate a reason to stay in the communities. In Siglufjordur, for instance, the Siglo Hotel, I believe that was a quote direct from the investors. But this one I love particularly, just the fact that we are a magnet. And I'm sure that if you can think of some of the sites that have been successful, you'll understand what I mean. They attract people and they make people want to stay. So the third of the research questions talked of partnerships and trails, and again, not a particular surprise to find that most of the sites that were successful were the ones that looked at partnerships. But what did strike me was that many of the partnerships and trails that exist in Europe are not known in Iceland. One of the ones that really struck me was the European Route of Industrial Heritage, which is only marginally known in Iceland and could be a huge marketing tool for most of these industrial sites. Look at support from stakeholders. And again, sorry if it sounds negative, but it is the base from which we can hopefully learn and improve. Incoherent heritage strategies just kept coming up and up. The fact that there doesn't appear to be much cohesion between much planning policy and industrial heritage. And on that note, in particular, I wanted to drill down into tourism, and I came up with that tourism almost entirely unlinked to the built environment. Stop me if I'm wrong. This is really just the information I'm getting from my interviews. I may well be out of line, but I'd be fascinated to know if I am on the right track. I believe that tourism policy and regeneration development plans are not required to link to the built environment. It's something that strikes me as particularly difficult to understand coming from a country where built environment and tourism seem hand in hand. I mean, I now live in France in a remote area, and the built environment is particularly important in the tourism offer. So the fourth of my questions I wanted to look at were the commonalities between sites, what they experienced as common understandings. And one of those that I picked out, I've called the gold rush mentality. Again, it's not meant to be, it's looking at what I think are important themes. And it strikes as particularly obvious coming from a site like the S, which was right of Canary Wharf, where making money was obviously more important than anything. A conversation with one of the management at Canary Wharf at what point when we were looking to try and have some support, and I was simply told, old doesn't work here. So the gold rush mentality, what I'm trying to understand from it is the idea of a drive to factor in economic imperatives. There seems to be something, I was told, maybe, that equates to the mentality or the mindset of the fishing industry, that there isn't much point in thinking too much about whether or not it's time to go and to collect a harvest or to take your ships out. It's something that you do at the moment, and this seemed maybe to drive the idea that the complexity of is perhaps something that isn't considered as carefully as it might be. And my question, what I've discussed, which were the issue of the individuals who are instrumental in becoming the leaders of these sites. They're often creative industries, often artists. They're obviously the people that can imagine the site before other people maybe do, and they are absolutely driven individuals. They are the nuggets, if you like, the seeds that we need to water and fund in order to get these projects off the ground. They are a common theme that is often one that comes up, as is the point that I made within the idea of commonalities, which is that of ugly buildings. And that is something that we will all be familiar with. When you look at an industrial site, many of them are obviously abandoned. Think back to the Bankside Power Station. And in many ways, they are considered to be worthy of demolition because they are in a terrible state. Some of these comments I like in particular because I can relate to them in terms of the ship that we first found when we bought it for £1. It was in a terrible state. It doesn't obviously relate to the buildings when they've been completed, and you'd be hard-pressed to call the Marshall House or any of the buildings that I've already cited ugly or dirty today, but once they've been restored, they become icons and symbols of local communities, and people find them tremendously worthy of saving once they've been past that point of abandonment. So the challenges and obstacles are one of the things that I wanted to look at, and that again is the question of scale. We've looked at some of the buildings already. The scale of these buildings is something that is extremely difficult to contemplate if you're looking at it at a state of abandonment. I've seen many of these structures and understood just how vast and daunting they are to the people who start off the restoration campaigns. And that is one of the reasons why that seems to lead to the next of my topics, which is really a personal or an emotive issue, and that is one of burnout. These individuals, these visionaries, if you like, the people who become the leaders of these projects at the very beginning, the artists, let's say, or the architects, commit a huge amount of their personal capital into the projects, and yet they get to a point sometimes where it's just not tenable, and they see the future as a bleak thing that hasn't actually come up to its full realization. And that's something that we need to understand when it comes to funding and support. A lot of the time, funders think that these buildings are huge money pits, that they're going to be impossible to realize. But as I've tried to explain, there are different levels of conservation, and these individuals are the ones that can bring together the support through volunteering, often. That doesn't mean that they have to be massive sinkholes for money, and neither do they have to be 100% completed, as I think I tried to explain in the examples of those that are conserved rather than restored. But once you get past, hopefully, the burnout of the individuals, you also find that they face skepticism when they are facing public opposition. And again, it comes back to this point about, in this state of abandonment, it's very difficult to foresee the possibilities that some of these individuals are capable of doing. And in order to bring the community with them, they must be able to communicate that vision. But that skepticism is there nonetheless. It may well be related back to these issues of humiliation or shame or a sense of abandonment or exploitation. And if we can get past those, hopefully we get to a point where we are on track, we've passed the point of critical danger and at risk, and we get to a point where we have buildings like the Shell station that are actually now seen as icons for the community rather than just a dirty old repair station. So on a last point, and again, as I said, this is not meant by in terms of criticism at Minjastofnun. I'm trying to understand a little bit about the listing regulations and the current legislation, and I'm looking at it as an outsider. I am trying to understand what is behind the 2013 Cultural Heritage Act that almost unilaterally protects 100-year-old buildings and yet leaves almost all buildings less than 100 years old unprotected. There's a lot of criticism among the interviewees about that act. It's only 8 years old. Maybe it's worth reviewing. Maybe it could be seen as a less binary piece of legislation, and that buildings that are within the 20th century could become considered worth saving. But it was certainly something that came up on frequent occasions in my conversations. And within that, the last of my points was simply that of demolition and loss. And I think I've pretty much covered that, but some of these quotes I found pretty poignant, especially there were references on many occasions to the area of Skúlagöta, which I didn't have the privilege of knowing, but I believe that it was a part of town which was probably worth saving, and which maybe today we might have made a different choice about saving. But we continue to knock down buildings which maybe in the future we might look back at in the same way as people look back at Skúlagöta today. So those were my research questions, and that's pretty much the nub of the talk, in the sense that that was the research that I came to do, having completed the projects I was involved with in London. And it's brought me to these conclusions, and again, they're open to discussion, but it clearly seems from the research that I did that the statutory legislation leaves many 20th century buildings unprotected. Of the other conclusions, there seemed to be a lack of public awareness of industrial heritage and a lack of awareness of the importance of 20th century buildings in particular. There seemed to be this very clear understanding that everything over 100 years old was good, everything under 100 years old, not so much. It clearly cannot be a way forward in terms of protection to be quite so black and white. A lack of coherent planning, particularly within tourism policy for the built environment, and regional funding that is erratic. Now, that's not an Icelandic issue. Regional funding for industrial heritage restoration is erratic at best, but it's just worth maybe pointing out. And the last of my points or conclusions was that the benefits of volunteering, from what I could understand, are being missed as a result of some embedded sense of suspicion, but also maybe of exploitation, which seemed to be a constant and recurring theme. And within that last conclusion, Dr. Cook just passed me yesterday something that I thought was incredibly valuable in the government's own paper on indicators for measuring well-being. Formal volunteering activities are listed as part of the UN SDGs. I'd like to know if that's making any progress in government strategy. But that's pretty much the extent of my work. This was just one of the slides I wanted to show you. This is the European Route of Industrial Heritage from their website. Gives you an idea of just how many sites are active in mainland Europe. There are, if you look on their site, 4 sites that in theory are active in Iceland, but from my investigation, I don't believe they are. But I think there's a huge amount to be done in terms of bringing that into Iceland's built environment. And finally, just some policy recommendations coming out of those conclusions. Extension, as you can imagine, of the ERIH. The integration of industrial heritage into tourism policy. New legislation to protect 20th century buildings. And a listings register of significant 20th century buildings. I know Minja Stoffnen has a map on the website of listed buildings, but I think the idea of a proactive initiative, budget notwithstanding, would be a very interesting project to consider. And finally, the implementation of a national volunteer agency, and maybe addressing the issues or the resistance that seems to exist to volunteering, and deconstructing this conflation between volunteering and internships, which are very, very different things. That's it from my point of view. I just wanted to thank Minja Stoffnen and the Maritime Museum for hosting the talk, all my participants, and all the research is available if you want to let me know if you'd like a copy. I'm sure I've trodden on a few toes. I'm sure I've upset some sensitivities, and I'm not intending to be critical as an outsider. I'm just fascinated in the subject, so please do shoot me down. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your interesting talk. I think we have time for some questions.
David, can you maybe repeat the questions or the essence of the question?
If
Because
we
we
have
can't
any.
pick up the audio.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay.
I'd just like to comment on your thoughts about listing and the 100-year rule and all that.
Thank you.
And I really don't take it as a criticism, or maybe I just am glad to hear this criticism, because this is a question that we are constantly wondering about and working with at Minnesota. And the 100-year rule is, I don't know if I can say that it's up for review.
Okay.
It's being discussed, and it will definitely be discussed seriously when the law is reviewed, whenever that will be. But there is still, in the law, there is this possibility of listing young things, especially, which then sets them apart from the other regular 100-year-old listings, automatic age listing. And I see this sort of automatic age listing as both a problem and a quality. Because as is, we are underfunded, and this is like the constant excuse. But it gives us the opportunity to get all these buildings in. We have a say about them. We can decide then when something is up for question. So that's a quality, it's a plus. The minus is that we are still only usually 3 people working with all of these buildings, and they are getting more and more every year, which means the workload goes into taking a stand on maybe something less important and not being proactive. And we are very interested in these industrial buildings, and luckily I think people are generally getting more interested in them, and we do get questions, and we often get asked about our opinion, even if they're not protected. Very important questions, and I think we really have to look at them when it's reviewed.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. I think it's very interesting.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm very interested also in this. To some extent, it creates a rod for your back, creating this increasing stock of buildings over 100 years old, that then just seems to absorb the resources, the few resources that are available. So anyway, things you know. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for answering. Also, I want to mention
Yes, tourism. So voluntourism is a business. Volunteering is not. Voluntourism is basically organized package tours for often either pre-university or just post-university students who are looking to work for good causes, and I put that in inverted commas deliberately, in disadvantaged parts of the world. It has become I would say, a sector of tourism and not a sector of volunteering. And it has considerable issues with sustainability, has a lot of issues with whether or not the work that is carried out is appropriate, is well managed, and is even required in the areas in which they go. And it's a big it's a big earner for those businesses involved. Volunteering, I see as strictly within the non-profit sector, and it tends to be community generated, and it is something that is essentially grassroots. And they are very, very different. And I believe that there have been some voluntourism projects in Iceland which have probably affected the reputation of volunteering in general. And that may be related to why it seems to generate these almost instant negative reactions. As an aside, I suggested, whilst I was doing my research, to one establishment that I could help over the weekends with their archive. And the reaction was, no, we don't do that, which is unusual to me. I mean, I didn't take it personally, I hope, but it's unusual to me that most non-profits in the UK have an established way in which you can contribute your time in some shape or form. Thank you. Thanks for listening.